Michael Jordan's arrival at Jenny's diner. It had been one of those long, draining days, meetings piled on top of meetings, endless handshakes, discussions on policies and decisions, none of which had given Michael Jordan the space to just breathe. As he drove through the quiet streets of Springfield, Ohio, a sense of exhaustion weighed heavily on him, not just from the physical demands, but from the mental and emotional toll of constantly being in the public eye. The constant scrutiny, the expectations placed on him had a way of sapping his energy, and all he wanted now was something simple, a quiet meal, a moment to gather his thoughts before the drive back. He had heard of Jenny's diner from a local he met earlier that day, someone who spoke of it with fondness. They described it as a place where time seemed to stand still, where every dish was homemade and every customer was a regular. The allure of something genuine, a place untouched by the noise of his world, had drawn him in. As he pulled into the small parking lot, the flicker of the neon sign beckoned him in, and the scent of grilled burgers and fresh coffee filled the air, offering a promise of comfort. Stepping inside, the familiar jingle of the bell above the door sounded like a welcome. The interior was cozy, with faded Polaroid pictures on the wall capturing memories of past customers and staff. The low hum of conversation created a warm, inviting atmosphere. There was something reassuring about it, a sense of timelessness in a world that often felt too fast-paced, too transactional. This was supposed to be a simple stop, a break from the chaos of his life. He walked up to the counter, his eyes meeting the hostess's gaze. For a split second, there was a flicker, just a brief moment of hesitation in her smile, something Michael caught instantly. It wasn't just the standard greeting. It was a pause, a flicker of doubt or uncertainty, quickly masked by a neutral expression. It was subtle, but it wasn't lost on him. He had been in enough situations to recognize when people weren't entirely comfortable with his presence. A few patrons in the diner glanced up, their eyes meeting his for a second longer than was comfortable. The weight of their gaze wasn't overt, but it lingered, making him realize that something wasn't right. The hostess, after that brief pause, finally spoke, her voice polite but cautious. "Good evening? Dining in or taking out?" The question, though simple, seemed oddly out of place considering the cozy familiarity of the diner. Michael, sensing the subtle shift in the room, answered calmly, "Dining in, if that's all right." His response was easy, almost dismissive of the slight tension in the air, but as he stood there waiting for a response, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite as it should be. The hostess's pause lingered in his mind, and he felt the eyes of the other diners on him, some curious, some a bit more wary, as if his mere presence had disrupted the natural rhythm of the diner. Refusal of service. The moment stretched out longer than it should have, the pause thickening the air between them. The hostess turned away briefly, glancing toward the kitchen as if seeking permission from someone beyond the counter. For a moment, Michael wondered whether this was simply a moment of confusion or hesitation. Maybe she was just too busy, or perhaps they were short-staffed. But then, when she returned, the change in her demeanor was palpable. It wasn't the kind of change someone made when faced with a busy shift or a routine problem. No, this was different. "I'm sorry, sir," the hostess said, her voice now firm, and there was no mistaking the tone. "We can't serve you tonight." Michael's stomach sank. His first instinct was to dismiss it, to laugh it off as some kind of misunderstanding. He'd been through his fair share of uncomfortable situations, especially in the public eye. He'd dealt with critics who misunderstood him, who judged him based on things they thought they knew. But being turned away from a simple diner, a place where people gathered for a cup of coffee and a meal, felt different. This wasn't the usual dismissive glance or polite turn of the shoulder. This was deliberate, personal. There was something thick in the air, something heavier than the usual tension of a crowded diner. Michael looked around, and that's when it became clear. A few heads had turned in his direction, not with curiosity, but with something else. The subtle whispers began, too quiet to catch, but loud enough to make the room feel smaller. The regulars, the people who had come to expect each other's presence in the same booths, were now turning their attention to him. He stood there for a moment, taking it all in. He wasn't angry. He wasn't furious. He was confused. And, more than anything, he was disappointed. This was a place that prided itself on familiarity, on being a local haven where everyone was welcome, no matter who they were. But Michael felt a cold weight shift in the room. The hostess wasn't looking at him with disdain, but with something else. Reluctance. Hesitation. It was as if she wasn't acting on her own, but under some silent command, as if she had been told what to do. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked, his voice steady but with an edge of genuine confusion. His question wasn't an accusation. It was an attempt to understand. He wasn't looking to fight, but to find out why this was happening. Why had he, a regular customer like anyone else, been singled out in this way? The words that hung in the air between them were thick with unspoken meaning. The hostess didn't flinch this time. We'd rather not serve you tonight," she said again, her voice unwavering. There was no explanation, no policy. The response felt like a verdict, final and absolute, and Michael felt the weight of it. This wasn't about a simple refusal. This wasn't about missing a reservation or ordering at the wrong time. This was about something deeper, a message that Michael wasn't entirely welcome in a space he had expected to be neutral. The room had fallen into a sharp silence. The clatter of silverware had stilled. The buzz of idle conversation that had once filled the air had stopped, leaving only the sound of Michael's steady breathing as he processed the situation. It wasn't the refusal itself that struck him most, but the weight of the moment. Why was he being treated this way? What had changed in this seemingly ordinary diner? The eyes of the customers were now fixed on him, some with judgment, others with curiosity, but all of them silently waiting for him to react. Confrontation with the manager, Tom. The tension in the room had escalated, the silence thick enough to almost feel suffocating. Michael stood there trying to absorb what had just happened, trying to make sense of the rejection. His mind was racing, but he remained still. He wasn't going to let this situation spiral out of control. Not with anger, not with frustration. Instead, he chose to confront it, to seek understanding where others might have chosen conflict. He wasn't going to walk away from this, not without finding out why. "Can I speak with the manager?" Michael asked, his voice calm but firm. The words were simple, straightforward, but they carried weight. He wasn't asking for special treatment. He wasn't demanding an apology. He was simply requesting an explanation, an opportunity to talk through the situation. The hostess hesitated once again, glancing toward the back of the diner, her eyes searching for some kind of silent approval, before nodding and disappearing behind the swinging kitchen door. The room seemed to hold its breath as everyone waited to see what would unfold next. The regulars, who had been so eager to watch the exchange, now seemed to shrink back slightly, as if unsure of what to make of Michael's response. The younger man, who had been openly critical, the one who had worn the smug look of someone expecting an outburst, was now watching with a sense of uncertainty. He had clearly been anticipating a fight, and Michael was denying him that opportunity. A few moments later, the door opened once more, this time with a man in his early 50s stepping through. His thick arms were crossed over his chest, a grease-stained apron hanging loosely over his broad frame. His face was weathered, hardened by years of service, of facing difficult decisions and dealing with customers. His name tag read Tom, but there was no introduction, no formal greeting. Instead, he simply stood in the doorway, taking in Michael's calm presence, sizing him up. "I hear you've got a question," Tom said, his voice carrying a challenge. It wasn't a greeting, but an invitation to a confrontation, one that Michael wasn't going to back down from. His posture was defensive, his arms tightly crossed, as if he was bracing for a storm. Michael stood tall, meeting Tom's gaze without hesitation. He wasn't about to shrink away from this moment. "Yeah, I'd like to know why you won't serve me." Tom didn't answer immediately. He looked around the room, as though searching for some sort of confirmation, for the approval of the customers who were watching this exchange unfold. The other diners, still silent, were now a quiet audience to the drama that had played out. Michael could feel their eyes on him, some waiting for him to explode, others quietly hoping for resolution. Finally, Tom spoke, his voice low and careful. "People around here got their opinions about you, about the things you stand for, and I've got a business to run. I don't want trouble." There was an edge to his words, the burden of responsibility, the weight of the decision he had made. But beneath that, Michael could hear something else, a hint of reluctance, as if Tom wasn't entirely sure he was making the right choice. Michael's mind processed the words, but the weight of them made the situation even more complicated. This wasn't about a personal grievance against him, not directly. It was about his identity, the things he stood for, the views that others had projected onto him. It was about fear, about keeping the peace, about avoiding the fallout from what would happen if someone like him walked into their diner. But Michael wasn't going to let that be the final word. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't challenge Tom with anger. Instead, he simply asked, "So, me sitting down for a meal is trouble?" The question was simple, but its implications were profound. Was his mere presence as a man with a public persona enough to disrupt this space? Was he being judged for his views, for his past, for things that others had decided about him without ever getting to know him as a person? Tom's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment Michael saw something different, a crack in the manager's defensive posture. There was no immediate answer. Tom shifted his weight, his gaze darting to the patrons in the diner, clearly feeling the pressure of their stares. It wasn't just Michael he was trying to manage in that moment. It was the expectations of the people around him. The unspoken rules of the community, the way things had always been done, were playing out before him. And it wasn't easy to break free from that. For the first time since Michael had walked into the diner, Tom appeared uncertain. The rigid stance of someone who had made a decision was softening, even if just slightly, and in that moment Michael understood something crucial. The situation wasn't just about him or about Tom's decisions. It was about all the unspoken expectations that came with living in a community where opinions were formed before facts, where people were judged by what they represented, not by who they were. "I'm just trying to understand," Michael said, his voice steady and unyielding. "Is this about me, or is this about what people think I stand for?" The words hung in the air. The question wasn't about defending himself. It wasn't about pointing out the injustice of the moment. It was about something deeper. The simple desire to be understood, to be seen as more than a stereotype, more than an image. In that moment, Michael wasn't fighting to be served. He was fighting to be heard. Michael's calm response. In the thick silence of Jenny's diner, Michael Jordan remained still, his posture calm and measured despite the turbulence of emotions that must have been surging through him. The eyes of the other patrons bore down on him, eager to see how he would react. Would he fight back? Would he cause a scene, turning this moment into the spectacle they all seemed to expect? He could have. He had the power, the voice, the reputation to turn this moment into something that would dominate the headlines. But Michael Jordan was no stranger to controversy. He knew that power could be used to escalate a situation, but wisdom and patience had a far greater impact. Instead of lashing out, Michael remained composed. His response wasn't one of anger or frustration. It wasn't a knee-jerk reaction fueled by the indignity of being refused service. He knew that in this moment, the most powerful thing he could do was remain calm, remain collected, and respond with the level-headed maturity that had defined him throughout his life, both as an athlete and a public figure. The expectation was that he would respond with outrage, but he chose to respond with understanding. He wasn't looking for sympathy, and he certainly wasn't going to fuel the flames of division that had already been kindled. He exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling in his chest, but his voice was calm as he spoke again, addressing Tom, the manager, who had been reluctant to offer an explanation. "I understand the situation," Michael said, his words steady. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply acknowledged the situation for what it was. "But I'm not here to argue or fight. I'm just trying to understand what this is about. What made you decide not to serve me?" The simplicity of the question made it all the more powerful. Michael wasn't asking Tom to justify himself. He wasn't demanding an apology. He wasn't putting him on the defensive. Instead, he was offering Tom an opportunity to talk, to explain the reasoning, to break through the tension, to bring the conversation into the light. Michael's voice was not an accusation but an invitation to dialogue, and in that moment it became clear that this wasn't just about a simple meal. It was about breaking down the walls that people often build up without thinking, without considering the deeper impact of their actions. The other patrons in the diner were still watching, some with wide eyes, others with expressions of quiet judgment. But Michael's calmness had shifted the dynamic. This wasn't the confrontation they had hoped for. the heated exchange that could have validated their preconceptions about who he was. Instead, they were witnessing something else. A man choosing to disarm the situation with his steady demeanor, his refusal to give in to the anger that was no doubt welling up inside him. "I'm not here to make trouble," Michael continued, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "I'm just trying to figure out why this happened. Why was I turned away?" The question wasn't just directed at Tom. It was a challenge to the larger issue, to the assumptions and divisions that were now playing out in this small diner. Michael wasn't going to let the situation slip into the shadows of misunderstanding. He was forcing it into the light where it had to be confronted. The room, once filled with tension, now seemed to hum with a quieter, more reflective energy. The simple act of Michael asking for understanding had already begun to break the barriers that had been built up by both Tom and the other diners. It wasn't about him trying to fix everything. It was about showing everyone, through his calm and patient response, that it was possible to confront difficult situations with dignity and grace. Michael wasn't trying to change everyone's mind in that instant. He wasn't attempting to dismantle the prejudices that might have led to this moment. But what he was doing was offering a different way to respond. He was demonstrating that you could confront discomfort and injustice not with anger and bitterness, but with clarity and reason. And in doing so, he had already begun to change the narrative in the room. A moment of reflection and conversation. As Michael Jordan sat there patiently waiting, the tension in the room began to slowly dissolve. What had initially felt like a confrontation, a moment charged with judgment, assumptions, and unspoken barriers, was now evolving into something unexpected. The usual dynamics of conflict, of a loud and immediate reaction, were fading, replaced by something deeper, a quiet, unfolding moment of reflection. Michael wasn't just waiting for an answer. He was making space for a conversation, one that had the potential to break through the layers of division and misunderstanding. The din of the diner, which had been interrupted by the silence of the confrontation, now returned to a low hum. But the atmosphere was different, lighter, less charged. People were still watching, but they weren't anticipating an explosion of anger. They were watching to see what would unfold next. And as they observed Michael's calm, it began to dawn on them that perhaps this wasn't the usual scenario where someone in his position would lash out or demand to be heard. Instead, Michael was offering them something much more powerful, an invitation to engage, to reflect, and to think beyond the surface. Tom, the manager, stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his gaze wavering between Michael and the customers in the room. For the first time, his posture softened slightly, though not entirely. There was an underlying sense of discomfort, yes, but it was no longer the kind of discomfort that pushed him into a defensive stance. It was a more reflective kind of discomfort, one that spoke to the internal conflict of wanting to do the right thing, but also facing the weight of external pressures. Michael's question, simple but profound, had struck at the heart of the issue. Is this about me, or is this about what people think I stand for? In that moment, the room shifted. The unspoken assumptions, the judgments that people had placed on Michael based on what they had heard or seen, were brought to the forefront. He wasn't just challenging Tom's decision. He was challenging everyone in the room to consider their own biases, their own perceptions, and to question the assumptions they had about him. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but contemplative. Tom looked around at the other patrons, his gaze lingering on a few familiar faces. The older man at the counter, who had once been chewing his food in quiet judgment, now appeared to be chewing on something else. A thought, perhaps, or a realization. The younger guy, who had been so quick to judge, arms crossed and smirking, was now sitting a little straighter, as if the question Michael had posed had made him rethink his own certainty. Michael's calmness had already begun to work its magic. It wasn't an immediate resolution, and it wasn't going to fix everything in the room, but it was a step toward understanding, a moment where everyone was forced to pause and consider the bigger picture. For Michael, this wasn't about demanding respect or trying to force an apology from Tom. It was about showing that there was more to a situation than just what was seen on the surface. It was about challenging everyone, from Tom to the other patrons, to consider the impact of their actions and judgments. "Look, I understand where people are coming from," Michael continued, his voice steady and thoughtful. "But I'm not here to fight. I'm here because I'm just like anyone else who comes into this place, looking for a meal, looking for a quiet moment. What I'm asking is that we don't let our assumptions cloud the truth, that we take a moment to really see each other for who we are, not just for what we think we know about each other." There was a subtle shift in the air. The judgment had lifted, replaced by something more difficult to ignore, a shared sense of accountability. Michael wasn't just talking about the way he had been treated. He was talking about the broader societal divide that often kept people from seeing each other fully, from engaging honestly, and from understanding each other in ways that went beyond surface-level judgments. And in doing so, he had created a space where, even if only for a moment, everyone in that diner could reflect on their own behavior and beliefs. Tom's gaze softened just slightly. The old man at the counter muttered something under his breath, something that might have been a small concession, though no one could be sure. The younger man in the booth, who had been waiting for Michael to retaliate, now sat with his arms uncrossed, as if the words had opened a door to a new understanding. Michael's response, calm and thoughtful, had done more than just diffuse the immediate tension. It had created a space for the kind of reflection that was often missing in moments of conflict. Instead of allowing the situation to spiral into division or anger, Michael had chosen to use it as an opportunity for connection, for showing that even in the face of adversity, dialogue, patience, and understanding could create an opening for change. He wasn't asking for everyone to agree with him. He was simply asking for a chance to be seen, to be understood, and in doing so he had shown that real strength wasn't in winning the fight, but in creating the space for people to reconsider the fight itself. Resolution and call to action. As the conversation unfolded, Michael Jordan's calm presence had already begun to shift the atmosphere in Jenny's diner. What had initially felt like a sharp division between him and the rest of the room, one defined by judgment, assumptions, and silence, was now dissolving, bit by bit. There was still tension, but it was no longer the kind that hung like a cloud over the room. It had softened, giving way to something else, a tentative openness, a space where reflection was now possible. Tom, the manager, who had initially stood rigidly behind the counter, now appeared different. His arms, once crossed tightly, were now relaxed at his sides, though he still struggled with the weight of the decision he had made. The vulnerability in his eyes was apparent, though he tried to mask it. Michael could see it, the flickers of uncertainty, the understanding that the decision to refuse service wasn't as simple as he had once thought. It wasn't just a matter of protecting his business or maintaining peace. It was a question of whether or not he had let his assumptions get the best of him. Michael wasn't demanding an apology. He wasn't seeking to tear down the manager's decision or shame him for it. Instead, he had simply presented the situation for what it was, a moment for everyone in the diner to reflect. He had given Tom an opening to reconsider the judgment that had been passed, not just on him, but on the entire situation. The question now was not about his refusal of service, but about how the rest of the room would respond. Tom shifted again, his gaze moving between the customers, the regulars who had been silently observing the exchange. The weight of the moment was clear. He could have dismissed the conversation. He could have stuck to his decision and turned Michael away without a second thought. But the space that Michael had created, a space built on understanding rather than anger, had opened the door for something different. "I'll tell you what," Tom said, his voice slower now, less defensive. He glanced briefly around the room, as if checking to see how the others might feel about his next words. "You sit here, finish this conversation, and if by the end of it, I don't think you're just another guy talking a good game, maybe I'll get my waitress to bring you a menu." The words were more than just a concession. They were an acknowledgement that perhaps, just perhaps, this situation could have been handled differently. That the assumptions made about Michael's character and intentions weren't as clear-cut as they had appeared at first. The room didn't shift entirely in an instant, but the collective atmosphere was lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. Michael didn't smile, but there was a subtle recognition in his expression. He nodded, his gaze steady. "All right, let's finish this conversation," he said, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of understanding. The room was still watching, but the tension had evaporated. It wasn't gone completely, but it was no longer the kind of tension that created division. Instead, it was a quieter kind of tension, one that spoke of reflection, of reassessment. The patrons in the diner, once so certain in their judgments, now seemed unsure of how to proceed. Their expressions, once filled with expectation for conflict, now looked more like curiosity. Curiosity about where this conversation would lead. And so, they sat there, Michael and Tom, continuing the conversation. No longer was it just about Michael being refused service. It was about something bigger. A moment where people who had been divided by assumptions were now being asked to reconsider, to reflect on the choices they had made and the judgments they had passed. Michael wasn't seeking to change anyone's mind in an instant, but he had created the kind of space where real reflection could take place. He had shown them that dialogue, patience, and understanding were far more powerful than any confrontation could ever be. In that moment, Michael Jordan's quiet strength had not only diffused a tense situation, it had sparked a shift in perspective both in the manager and the patrons of the diner. The real victory here wasn't in getting a meal or in forcing an apology, but in creating the kind of conversation that led to deeper reflection and understanding. And as the conversation continued, the message was clear. Sometimes, the most powerful action is not reacting in anger, but in inviting others to see things from a different perspective. By showing restraint, Michael had opened the door for change, not just for himself, but for the entire room. If you've been moved by this story, take a moment to reflect. Have you ever been in a situation where understanding and patience made all the difference? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire meaningful conversations.